Welcome to today's webinar titled Reigniting the Passion After Deployment. We are thrilled to have Michael Scott with us today. Michael Scott was raised in a military family and remembers well the many rewards and challenges experienced as a child with a father in the Navy. As an adult, Michael attained a master's degree in counseling from Old Dominion University and has experience providing counseling to military families and their children as a therapist in a children's mental health inpatient facility. Michael brings an ongoing passion for service members and their families to his current role as manager of training for the Military OneSource program. Without further delay, I will turn things over to Michael Scott.
All right, hello everyone, and thank you, Stan, for the introduction. I'd also certainly like to welcome everyone to the presentation, Reigniting the Passion After Deployment. So whether I think you're a service member anticipating the return of a loved one, or following a deployment, or a spouse looking for ideas now that your loved one has returned, I hope I can share with you some more ideas or some strategies or certainly some resources worth considering as you figure out how to best find or re-find passion and intimacy in your marriage once you've been reunited. For what it's worth, I have been married for 10 years, and I've certainly experienced times when we've been separated and come home, but I wouldn't presume to even think that any of those experiences could approximate the wide and varied experiences that so many military couples face. I will say that I have had the opportunity to work with some military families and talk with some couples in particular who have experienced some of this, and I'll do my best to share what I've gained through those discussions, as well as some strategies that could be considered maybe best practices within any effort to reignite passion and romance and intimacy. So a couple of things to note. I will have a couple of references to share along the way, so if you want to consider having a pen and paper handy during the presentation, it might be helpful to allow you to take a few notes here and there if you like, or even better, perhaps to jot down a question or two if they occur to you. I'd certainly love to have the opportunity to answer a few questions and maybe tailor some of what information I may have to maybe something that's more specific to you. So with that, I'll start by reading this brief disclaimer. The appearance of hyperlinks does not constitute endorsement by the Department of Defense of this website or the information, products, or services contained therein. For other than authorized activities such as military exchanges and morale, welfare, and recreation sites, the Department of Defense does not exercise any editorial control over the information you may find at these locations. Such links are provided consistent with the stated purpose of this Department of Defense sponsored webinar. All right, so with that, there are, of course, a few simple objectives for the presentation, and it'd certainly be my hope that by the end of it, each of you would have some greater awareness for issues that present barriers to intimacy and passion, and perhaps some helpful practices that can be engaged in to reignite that passion and hopefully increase intimacy. There is an agenda, and of course that's going to include an introduction. We'll talk a little bit about, rather than talking about these things in the sense of what extinguishes passion, I think that we can talk about some obstacles to refinding that passion, and then very specifically things that you can do to help to reignite that passion. So as an introduction, I think it is worth taking a moment to find some objective idea of what passion is and what it could mean to reignite it. I think there's a lot to be considered in that statement, and it certainly may mean an awful lot of different things to the wide variety of folks who may be considering this. But the first definition, and I guess at the base of it all, the first definition for passion that I was able to find is this idea of strong and barely controllable emotion. And I think we all have an easy potential to romanticize the notion of passion and desire something like it from our romantic partners. We, I think, might even then, in certain times, over the life of our romances, it's easy to think of times when this was the case and times when it may have been diminished. So the idea of reigniting something that once was is indeed romantic, but not always, I think, maybe a best way to think about it. Over time, as we romantic partners change and grow in uncountable ways, I guess in a sense I want to shape the thought around reigniting passion to one of reigniting a new passion, or one that fits who we are now, rather than the idea of chasing a passion that once was and was maybe right for who we were then. So the idea of strong and barely controllable emotion, I think, can absolutely be found again, if it's not the case already. But it may also take some redefining of that, and could certainly, now that relationships may have matured, encompass a greater emphasis on some different emotions that are strong that you may have for each other. So I think, again, as we liken the notion of passion to one of intimacy, or I'd say even to be more direct, when we use the word passion, oftentimes we're very directly talking about sex. So if it's, I think talking about passion has even become sort of a acceptable code for ultimately, what is sex. And so, to be frank about it, this presentation, I think, in many ways will address that from that perspective as well. So I want to say that as well, it's certainly most normal for couples to have some difficulty reconnecting after deployment, and it's certainly normal as well for there to be a wide variety of feelings related to both a real and perceived lack of passion and intimacy. I think, I'll note that a friend of mine who's a longtime military spouse indicated to me that whatever dynamic exists upon reuniting, and regardless of how long it may exist, normal could still be applied. Normal certainly would be the case for a wide variety of kinds of things that people might experience upon that reuniting. And what she also explained is that even when one reuniting after a deployment was one way, an expectation for it to be the same the next time was unrealistic. And we'll talk some more about expectations as we go along here. All right, so the next point to make is that the idea of reigniting something is exactly that. It's a very active word and requires action. It's not just passion or romance or intimacy or sex or good communication or love. That all of that requires active work, and every single aspect of our relationship requires some activity or some effort on our part. Waiting for things, especially things that we're dissatisfied with, to resolve on their own oftentimes does have the exact opposite effect and increases the divide. And so I think taking action by perhaps first even listening to this webinar can be a great step, and maybe only a first step, though, as you consider the other steps you can take towards resolving something that may be, at this point, or anticipated to be less than what may be satisfying to you. So in a sense, this is kind of a call to action to consider what things can you do. But before we talk about those things that you can do specifically, I think it is worth talking about some of those obstacles that exist when we start to think about reigniting passion. I also want to say that as we go over these various items, this is certainly not a comprehensive list, and there's a great many that one might consider in your own unique situations that could represent some obstacles. But I'll also add that, as it notes here, these things can extinguish the passion. They're also very realistic parts of all of our daily lives. And so I think while it can be thought of as obstacles, they're also things to be overcome. And when they raise their head in periods of passion, they certainly do have the potential to extinguish something in the moment. So first to note is this idea of unrealistic expectations, and I think that is an idea that permeates every aspect of the deployment cycle and requires some management thereof. I think it's not just necessarily unrealistic expectations, but really any expectations that we have around the time of reuniting and our expectations for passion or intimacy or sex or all of those pieces. Any expectations has the potential to disrupt what could be an easy flow back into the relationship. These expectations have to be managed in a very overt way and in a very aware way by both partners in anticipation of reunion, as well as all throughout the course of the deployment cycle. So there's also, in the sense of considering expectations are sort of future thinking, and while there's great value in having some thoughts towards the future as well as some thoughts around the past, there's much to be said for living in the moment when considering reigniting passion, and rather than living in sort of the future or the past when working on finding your own passion again, or perhaps receiving that from your partner. Okay, so to go a little further, resentments are certainly the kind of thing that can be a great obstacle to refinding that passion. And they usually only grow over time unless they're attended to in some way. And I have always found that when I'm feeling some sort of resentment, or in couples that I've worked with are encountering some resentment, getting that out in the open is sometimes some of the hardest thing to do, because oftentimes they start really small and are easily rationalized away as not worth mentioning or a battle not worth fighting. But oftentimes, I think over time, resentments really do only have the potential to grow. And when they've grown so big that you finally consider addressing them or attending to them, it's very difficult, and much defensiveness comes into play, and oftentimes it takes a little longer. So I think there's great ways to manage those resentments, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the things you can do. Certainly money problems, but I would even take problems off of the list there and just say money in general. I think discussion of finances can certainly interrupt passion if the passion is there, but since we're more specifically talking about reigniting the passion, I think that issues surrounding finances are one that every couple has to find a way to manage. And again, strategies can be put into place to in some way attempt to separate our finances and money and really the business of the family or the couple from the romance and the intimacy of the couple. I think there are ways to separate it, and sometimes they're very difficult, but worth attending to. Next piece here is lengthy or multiple deployments, but again, I'll add to that to say it's certainly not just lengthy or multiple deployments, but also the qualities of those deployments. Is certainly enough of an obstacle alone to consider the time and frequency of a deployment, but if we add in the emotional toll on the service member, depending on some of those things that the service member has experienced while away, or the wide variety of what could be very harrowing experiences that they've been exposed to, and combine that with the potential to be dealing with injuries that a service member may have incurred, or even some mental illness that may have come up in the course of that deployment, all certainly have the potential to be disruptive towards reigniting passion. So also, and this final one, this idea of the day-to-day grind after deployment, even in just reading that, it occurs to me that even thinking about it as a day-to-day grind is some way disparaging of what really can be at times just considered the routine of not being on deployment, and that sometimes certainly takes a lot of adjustment on the part of the service member, adjustment on the part of the family that he or she may be returning to, and with any adjustment, really the best thing is that time can allow for that, and certainly good communication. So as I mentioned, good communication, that brings us into the opportunity to talk a little bit about the things that you can do, and how appropriate, given that today is just a few days before Valentine's Day. I think it may be on many of our minds what kinds of things we can do to reignite passion if it's in some state of dissatisfaction, or to maintain it if it's great. And certainly if deployment is a factor in that passion, I think that this is a time of year when we all find ourselves thinking about it. And without fault, the very first one on the list is this idea of taking time to talk to your spouse. Talking and communicating, I would rank as one of the very most important things. In fact, it really does serve as a basis for the quality of really any given relationship over time. And it's at this point that I'll make a note of a book that I found helpful in my own marriage, and know some others who have as well. This particular book is called His Needs, Her Needs, and it has a subtitle of Building an Affair-Proof Marriage. And this one is by William F. Harley, Jr., and that's last name is H-R-L-E-Y. And interesting, in this book, one point that is made is it identifies the second most important thing that a woman can do without, and that's certainly a sweeping generalization, but it's this idea of conversation and intimate conversation. So in addition to the value of just taking the time to talk with your spouse, to having great communication about the many things that affect your lives on a day-to-day basis, but also it's the general conversation is something that I think more so than just a woman or a man, but that both people in a couple must is an ingredient that absolutely must make up great relationships. That ability to communicate can resolve, indeed, so many of the issues that we can recognize as obstacles. Oftentimes, I think it's valuable to separate some of the sort of the family or the couple business pieces of communication from the intimate or the just great conversation kind of communication that is so valuable in the course of our relationship. And oftentimes, and perhaps even at the very beginnings of our relationships, it was exactly this conversation around some of what our dreams or our goals were, or some interesting observations throughout the day that really caused perhaps one or the other of us to fall in love with the other. And it certainly has the potential to do so again. But once again, it takes a specific effort to engage in this kind of conversation, especially when so much of our conversation upon return from deployment can surround things like financial issues or issues with the household or issues with the kids, and oftentimes that can sap up all of our time for conversation, leaving little room for that kind of conversation that we may have once had perhaps way back when we were dating, and that oftentimes led to that wonderful, uncontrollable emotion and passion that we experienced at different times in the course of our relationship. I couldn't say enough about the value of great communication with your spouse. There are literally tons and tons of resources out there that assist in helping couples find great ways to communicate. Again, here's another resource that I'll throw out there as well, that in addition to great suggestions and great topics and that are very relevant to the military, it also offers various tools and rating scales and ways to consider, evaluate, and think about the quality of the communication in your marriage. And that's just one small part of this website. If you're not familiar with it already, this website is www.pairs.com, and that's PAIRS.com. And PAIRS stands for interest's sake, Practical Application of Intimate Relationship Skills. There's a tab at the top on the website there called Military Couples. And if you click on that tab and you scroll down just a bit, there's a whole crowd of categories that are relevant to military families and military couples and allow for you to build great communication in addition to all kinds of other skills. In fact, the very first category in the list there is called Readjusting for Deployment. So I'd certainly encourage everyone who is interested in reigniting passion, and in particular after a deployment, to consider visiting that website. And again, it's www.pairs.com. And there, again, you'll find all kinds of information that will contribute to building your ability to communicate. I think communication and just generally talking with your spouse is one of the best and perhaps most efficient ways to reignite some of that passion. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, just to move on a bit, it's reasonable to expect that intimacy and sexual relations may be awkward at first upon return from deployment. I think awkward is one way to put it, but I think that another way might be to say that it takes some adjustment and it takes some re-getting to know each other. And I think it's also undeniable that each of you has changed in a variety of ways over the course of time, and it's necessary to get to know each other before perhaps you can fully reignite that passion. And that just, again, contributes to the idea of easing back into the relationship over time. Certainly being patient with each other, and that's probably one of the most valued qualities in any given relationship, is the ability to be patient and to have grace as each takes the time to adjust to the new reality. And then again, this last piece leans further on the idea that it is a very active process towards reigniting this passion, and learning and practicing ways of doing so will not only serve to build your comfort with each other, but also give you that bits and pieces in an easing kind of way back to what may have been a passion that you've experienced before, and ultimately a new passion. Okay. So there are some other things that can be done as you're taking the time to reignite that passion. And I think, though I mentioned before, seeking a same passion that you may have once experienced is maybe not the most realistic thing, but to seek something similar or to seek a new passion or a new reality based on who you are now is valuable, and reminding yourselves about what some of those passions surrounded when you were at times when that passion may have existed before is certainly valuable. I think it's great to spend the time talking about and thinking about times when, in the early days when you may have first started dating, to thinking about those things that may have attracted you to your spouse then and what they could be now, as it's quite reasonable that some of that may have changed over time. This also encourages this notion or concept of love letters, and I think there's an awful lot to be said in what can be accomplished with letters. There's certainly powerful ways of communicating, especially when there's a physical divide. They can, in so many ways, also serve to diminish some of those unrealistic expectations. So not just the love letters, but the regular letters that get written. Taking the time to form the words and to consider your thoughts and the message you want to convey is such a valuable thing. And it notes here, but I think we all can be aware of the power of the words we use. I think it's important to note you certainly don't have to be a poet. Simple statements can be just as meaningful, again, as long as they're thoughtful, and what's valued oftentimes is the time that's been taken to lay pen to paper or to key out a letter to one or the other. I think I can speak for myself. I always appreciate those letters that are written, whether they come in the form of little notes in the morning or letters just handed to me in person or found in my lunchbox. There are lots and lots of ways to communicate a message of love that is easily seen as thoughtful through letters. To move on just a bit, the idea of complimenting your partner in some way, I think, is a valuable one. It gives you a chance to, one, on your own, consider the compliments you might give, but as well to take the time to think about those things that you really do love and appreciate about your spouse. It does, without a doubt, let your spouse know that you care, again, as long as they are delivered with genuineness and thoughtfulness. It will serve to build confidence, and oftentimes, and while this wasn't noted on one of the previous pages of obstacles, confidence can certainly be, or the lack thereof, a huge obstacle towards reigniting that romance, and confidence or compliments can often serve to build that confidence once again. And then, of course, one or the other of us may gravitate towards complimenting appearance or physical characteristics, but I think it's a fantastic exercise for those of us who need to take the time to think about the compliments we give, to also remember it's those intangible characteristics of personality that can also just as powerfully build confidence, as well as those that may complement an appearance. And this as well, the idea of attending not just to the kids, but attending to a spouse. I think sometimes it's really easy, especially for those couples with children, to reignite that passion when there are children in the family as well. So it's just a slight reminder to make sure that you're managing the time that is just as valuable to give to your kids as it is to your spouse. Oftentimes upon that moment of, or that time of coming back from a deployment, there are so many things that are demands on everyone's time as adjustments get made and the various parts of a life are reacquainted with. It's easy to get swallowed up by those who demand the most, and sometimes that can certainly be our kids. So take the time to separate that out and attend to your spouse when the time has come for y'all to reunite. And then it also identifies the idea of planning dates with your spouse, and this can take a wide variety of forms, but I can say with confidence from my own marriage that when the time is put in to plan some time with me, whether it's my wife planning for me or for me planning for my wife, it's often those little details that allow time to be spent together that really do show, again, that the one or the other partner cares and wants that time. It's valuable to create routines, and not just routines around date night, but routines around good times for communication, routines around that reinforce time boundaries around time spent with family versus time spent with kids. And one of those great routines can certainly be setting a date night with your spouse. Once you set the routine, sometimes it's easy to fall into that routine, and that can be a really nice thing as well. So if you're planning ahead and arranging for childcare and taking the time ahead to prepare yourself for the night out, whether it's your appearance or even just your mindset, and then planning that night in such a way that fosters a time for good communication, for good conversation. I think it's of note, as we've identified earlier, that one of those obstacles to rekindling a romance can certainly be money issues, and it's always appreciated when that's taken into consideration as well in planning for this particular date you might be planning. So whether it's simple or lavish, I think regardless, the time you spend planning for such a thing is going to create an opportunity to rekindle that romance and passion as well. So to summarize some of what we've covered today, some couples certainly feel a lack of passion and intimacy after deployment, and that's a very normal occurrence. Reigniting passion requires action, and I believe we covered that with some emphasis. Barriers to intimacy and passion can include things like unrealistic expectations, resentments, and many problems. Patience with each other is a tremendously important piece of the time that it takes to fully reignite passion. There's value in practicing methods to reignite that passion, as well as things like love letters and notes and planning dates. And then finally, and we hadn't really covered this in the course of the presentation, but if your dissatisfaction with the quality of the passion in your romance is something you feel is beyond your ability to address or continue to bring to a level that you're satisfied with, then help is out there. It's out there in a huge variety of ways. And probably one of the most, I'll say the most valuable resource I know of is Military OneSource. And you can access Military OneSource in a couple of different ways. You can go to our website, which is militaryonesource.mil. You can call at 1-800-342-9647, or you can actually chat in as well, and you can reach one of our consultants via chat by visiting the website. And on our website, there are all kinds of articles as well that reinforce some of the ideas we've spoken about, and indeed give even more ideas that you might consider in your effort to reignite this romance and passion. So with that, I certainly wish you all the best in doing so, and depending on the perspective you carry into this presentation, I certainly hope that you're walking away with something that you'll find valuable. And, at this time, I'd love to open it up to anyone if there are any questions.
Thank you, Mike. We do have a couple of questions that came in. The first question reads, how can something that's the cornerstone of your marriage suddenly feel so foreign? And it's not just the physical part. Where do I start to reconnect with my spouse who is returning from a second deployment?
Well, so certainly I want to take a moment to thank you and your spouse for your service. I think it's a broad and sweeping question, and so I'll try to tackle it piece by piece. The first was, how can something so, let me make sure I understand it right, how can something so important or a cornerstone of your marriage seem so foreign upon a reuniting? And so I'll try to take that piece first. I think that being encountering deployments and encountering separation from your loving partner is always going to be difficult. There's grief associated with the loss that you experience in the time that this person is away. And over that time, it's impossible that both of you have not grown in a variety of ways. In fact, I wouldn't hesitate to say that you are each very different people in many regards. And so those cornerstones that we may lean so heavily on or find so valuable in our lives can get shifted. And I wouldn't say that there are tremendous aspects of who we are that have changed so much that those cornerstones haven't changed entirely, but I think that they have shifted based on new perspectives with the world, and certainly the complications associated with a deployment, the harrowing experiences he or she may encounter while deployed, but not just that, the encounters that you may have when you're now home perhaps in a location that you may not have grown up in, or you're home being a single mom for the first or the second time, or a single father, depending on your situation. All of those experiences are going to grow us. And so, of course, it would seem that these things might seem foreign upon reuniting. And for that matter, the importance of great communication, of celebrating each other's growth, of taking the time to identify it, acknowledge it, and again to celebrate it. Indeed, it's those conversations that we had perhaps way back when we were dating that really allowed us to fall in love with each other. And while it may seem foreign, I think I could cast it in a slightly more positive way and say that it's an opportunity to re-fall in love with each other all over again. And I think that when we look at it from that perspective, and please forgive me if I'm if I'm making it overly positive. I know it's a difficult thing to consider in a situation. But there can be some joy found in that as well. And if we seek out the joy, indeed, I think it can be found. So I know that was the first part of the question, and I got a little wrapped up in that part. Stan, could I ask you to repeat the second part, please?
Sure. Where do I start to reconnect with my spouse who is returning from a second deployment?
Got it. So based on the way the question is phrased, I'll take it from the perspective that the spouse has not yet arrived home, and that being the case, then what is being encountered already are expectations that may or may not have to do with how things were upon the reuniting after the first deployment. And so I think there are a variety of things that can be done. One of the ways that you can start, I think, is to take some inventory and maintain some awareness of what your personal expectations may be, how they relate to what the previous experience of reuniting was, and how they may very well not relate to this particular experience. I think I don't want to say lowering our expectation, but being aware of them is certainly valuable, and considering them for the realisticness of them. This return could be vastly different than the previous, and there's some adjustment that takes place as we maybe desensitize slightly over time with multiple deployments. Taking that into consideration, I think that, so taking inventory and managing expectation is a great place to start within yourself, but certainly opening whatever lines of communication are possible with your spouse as he's preparing to arrive home as well, or she. And so certainly those letters, those emails, those opportunities for conversation are valuable. And I think that letters can oftentimes really provide an opportunity for you to share what some of those expectations may be, what some of those cornerstones that you identified in the earlier part of the question for your marriage may be, and perhaps sort of opening your heart in those communications to allow for some of that normalizing upon return home. So those are just some of my first thoughts. I would also encourage you once again to consider visiting the pairs.com website. I think there's some great suggestions there as well.
Well, thanks, Mike. Next question reads, I appreciate the point about adjustment and really anything being normal, but how would I know when to consider some additional assistance from a counselor or something like that?
Well, I think as soon as the question comes up in your mind, I'd say that's a reasonable point at which to consider seeking some additional assistance. So oftentimes we find ourselves trying to manage or navigate the waters of a deployment cycle or an adjustment to reuniting, and it can feel overwhelming, but when we see slight bits of progress over time, we're encouraged and we're willing and capable of continuing on the path of ultimately reigniting that passion. I think when it feels so overwhelming or we're seeing little or no progress, that we start to ask ourselves, I wonder if some outside help would be helpful. I think in that situation, there's two paths that can be considered. I think that perhaps it could be, or it's worth having some awareness of, is this more just my issue, and perhaps I need to consider talking to someone who is objective about how I'm feeling, or is this perhaps an issue that both of us could benefit from having some objective person consider from both of our perspectives? And one way or the other, if the idea has come up in your mind at all, I think it's absolutely worth calling Military OneSource as one particular reference, or checking our website out to find things that may either reinforce your idea that help could be necessary, or even just to have that initial conversation to see if counseling may be something that could help you over time. Personally, I'm always an advocate for counseling. It's my trade, if you will, and I think there's always value in getting the objective perspective of someone who's uninvolved, whether it's with just you individually or with you as a couple.
Okay, great. There are no other questions that have come into the queue, so at this time, Michael, I would just like to thank you for sharing your invaluable experience and expertise. I would also like to thank our attendees for participating in today's webinar and submitting questions. If you find yourself having questions after the webinar is over, please email moswebinars@militaryonesource.com, and I'll get your questions over to our presenter, and we'll get an answer back to you as quickly as we can. This concludes today's webinar on reigniting the passion after deployment. Thank you all for attending, and have a great day.